Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
For the past couple of weeks in this congregation, we've been looking at God's response to the injustice in the world. We heard the thundering prophecy of Amos, declaring that God will not stand by while some people suffer and struggle while others turn away in apathy. Injustice stirs God's wrath, which is either good news or bad news depending on where we're standing. It's bad news if we're standing on the backs of poor people. It's good news if we're standing alongside and together with people who are poor and vulnerable and marginalized. And if we're standing together on the promises of God, it is good news. And last week we heard Jesus' confronting parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And we explored what it means for us not merely to have a thought for the less fortunate, but actually to be a friend to people living in poverty, as God in Christ is a friend to all of us. Tonight's reading from Mark 10 is about Bartimaeus, and it's an account that draws us even deeper into God's response to the injustice of the world. The account of Jesus giving sight to Bartimaeus is recorded in various forms in 3 of the 4 Gospels, but Mark's account has some striking details that offer us an insight into Jesus' work in Bartimaeus' life and in our lives, and what it can mean in our lives tonight. You know, we're going to look at those details in a minute, but first, it's important to recognize that there are no unimportant details. There are no insignificant details in Mark's narrative. If there's a detail in Mark's narrative, you know this is important. It's there for a reason. Because in most of his narrative, Mark doesn't get bogged down in details. The Gospel of Mark is the gospel in a hurry. It's in a rush. It's generally regarded as the earliest of the 4 Gospels to be written, and it is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. John's Gospel, in contrast, John's Gospel begins with this beautifully drawn, poetic prologue. The first chapters of Matthew and Luke spin out birth narratives and genealogies. Mark doesn't have time for those things. He gets right into it. You know, by the time we get halfway into the chapter 1 in Mark, Jesus is already calling disciples. He's getting stuck into ministry. It's a gospel in a hurry. If the other gospels are composed like oil paintings with layers and subtle textures, Mark is more like a quick pencil sketch, just capturing the essential details. Mark's language lacks the literary polish we find in some of the other Gospels. We can really see that in the original Greek. Mark writes in the language of the street. It's blunt, direct, to the point. Sometimes even a little crude. It's right there. It's raw. He doesn't have time to pretty it up. Mark's gospel starts fast, and then it keeps accelerating. Jesus does one thing, and then immediately he does another thing, and then immediately he does another thing. And the word immediately occurs more than 40 times in this shortest gospel. It is a gospel in the hurry. It's just on this rush until it ends breathlessly in mid-sentence. So you see, when Mark slows down, when he does take time to share details, he has a reason. Pay attention. They're important. Which brings us back to Bartimaeus. And now there's a striking detail right out of the gate. Bartimaeus has a name. And that's a relatively unusual thing in a healing account in the Gospels. He's given a name. And it suggests that there's something more going on here than simply a healing story. Yes, Jesus does heal Bartimaeus, but he does something more. When Mark introduces us to Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus is stuck on the side of the road. He sits there day after day after day with nothing but his cloak to keep him warm at night. His cloak is all that he has to shelter him from the harsh elements. It's all that he has to protect him from the harsh world. His cloak is his security, it is his comfort, it is his most valued possession. He clings to it for dear life. Bartimaeus is blind, and in first century Palestine, that's bad news. It means all he can do is beg. Day after day after day, he sits and begs for people to have pity on him, to give him enough just to get through that day and into the next. And as we saw looking at John 9 a number of weeks back, there is no real option for a blind man in first century Palestine. There's no list of things that he could do. There's no sense that we had, as we have today, that a blind person can be a valuable contributor or leader in the community. No, there was none of that. For Bartimaeus, his only hope for survival is to scrape by on the scraps and the spare change that people might throw his way. And his world is a really tiny one. It's a really tiny world. He never ventures far from his patch because he can't see. He lives in his comfort zone, literally. He relies on the familiar to find his way, the touch of a familiar wall, the counting of a familiar number of steps from one place to the next, the familiar sounds and smells of various stalls in the Jericho marketplace. This is how he finds his way in the world. And he does find his way in this very small world of his when the way is familiar, but most of the time he stays on the side of the road where he sits day after day after day, stuck. I believe that there's someone in this room tonight who can relate to that. Maybe your circumstances might be very different from Bartimaeus. You have a job that pays you well. You have a nice place to live. Or maybe you have nowhere to lay your head at night. Either way, I believe that there's someone in this room tonight who can relate to Bartimaeus, who knows what it is to be stuck, who can identify with him. There's someone here tonight who's feeling stuck in your life, like you're sitting on the side of the road watching the world pass you by. Someone in this room tonight is feeling like Bartimaeus would have been feeling, is this all my life is going to be? Is this it? You wish it could be more, but you just can't see it. And maybe you've had things go against you in life, things go wrong in life, not little things, not minor things, big things. Big things. Things that have knocked you off your track, things that have knocked you off your feet, that have held you down and have held you back. For Bartimaeus, it wasn't just his blindness that held him back and held him down. It was a community that looked down on him as a blind beggar, that saw no value in him, that saw no potential in him. No one looked him in the eye. No one called him friend. The closest thing he had to a friend was his cloak. He wasn't just living with blindness. He was suffering from injustice. And if there is someone here who can identify with Bartimaeus, if there's someone who's feeling like life is just not fair, like this world is just not fair, if there's someone who knows what it is, let me say this to you. I don't know what it is that has gotten you stuck in life. I don't know what it is that is holding you back and holding you down. All I know is that it is every bit as overwhelming to you as the things that bound Bartimaeus were to him. It's real. Otherwise, you wouldn't be stuck. I don't know what it is that has you stuck, but God knows. Hear the good news. God knows. God knows your story in every detail, inside and out. And God knows that you're not lazy or you're not apathetic. You're stuck. God knows that how you have tried to break free. God knows how you have tried to move on. God knows the pain that you hold inside, the pain that you won't let anyone see. God knows. But maybe like Bartimaeus, you have gotten tired from all your trying. You're trying to break free. You're trying to move on. And you have confined yourself. You have consigned yourself. You have resigned yourself to the way it is. This is it. This is my life. Listen. Listen. God is not going to stand idly by. Listen. Bartimaeus hears it. Do you hear it? He's sitting there, stuck on the side of the road, but he hears it. He hears a crowd coming through. He hears the shuffling of sandals on the gravel and the stones. He hears the sound of a crowd when they're talking as they pass by on the road. He hears all the voices talking at once. He listens, but he can't make it out until the crowd starts to thin, until it's mostly passed him by, and he just hears the stragglers at the back of the crowd, and then he can make out what they're talking about. It is Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus has just passed him by with this great crowd of people, the one person who can help him, and he's afraid that he's missed him. And as the crowd passes him by, he desperately cries out to Jesus, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people try to hush him up. "Be quiet, beggar. Shh." They don't want this blind beggar making a scene, especially not in front of Jesus. And they rebuke him. "Be quiet. Show some respect." But Bartimaeus, he has been held back all his life. He has been held back for too long, and he is not going to be held back now. He cries out as loud as he can, desperate for Jesus to hear him over the din of the crowd. "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus hears his cry. Jesus hears his cry, and he stops. Jesus has set his course for Jerusalem. He is resolutely on his way there, but when he hears Bartimaeus crying out, he stops. And now watch this detail. Jesus stops and he says, "Call him." Isn't that a strange, odd, curious thing to say? There's a blind man sitting over there yelling his head off, and Jesus says, call him. Well, why doesn't Jesus just walk over to Bartimaeus? Why does he say, call him? We're starting to see that this is something more than simply a healing story. Jesus has something more in store. He says, call him. And he says it to these people, these same people who have just been trying to hush him up. These same people who, shh, beggar, shh. He enlists them in his ministry. Call him. And they do. They do. They do call him. They call him and they say, take heart. On your feet. He's calling you. See, Bartimaeus, he sees something that no one else has seen. He sees something that the Pharisees haven't seen. He sees something that Jesus' disciples haven't seen. He sees who Jesus is. He has an insight into where Jesus is headed. Bartimaeus is the first person to call Jesus Son of David. No one else sees it. And Jesus commands those around him, call him. And when they say, take heart, the NIV says, cheer up. I love the NIV, but they've missed it here. The Greek is so much more powerful. And cheer up. No, it's take heart. Take courage. He is calling you. On your feet. Do you hear Jesus calling you from your stuck place? Maybe all you want from him is for him to fix up a few things for you, maybe to fill a sense of emptiness or longing in you, maybe to comfort you in the pain that you're feeling or to change some of the circumstances in your life, but he has something more in mind for you. He is calling you. Bartimaeus, he's calling you. So what is Bartimaeus going to do? It seems obvious, right? I mean, he's cried out to Jesus at the top of his lungs, and Jesus has stopped, and Jesus has called him. What is he going to do? He's going to get up and go to him, right? Obvious, right? Well, no. Remember, this is not what Bartimaeus does. He doesn't just get up and go places, ever. He lives confined to his comfort zone, and this is definitely not in his life map. Jesus is calling him, but Bartimaeus doesn't know how many steps it's going to be between him and Jesus. All he has is a general direction. He doesn't have a familiar wall to feel with his hand. He doesn't know what obstacles might be in his way. Think of the courage. Think of the faith that it takes him to respond to Jesus' call. Mark tells us that he throws aside his cloak and jumps to his feet. Did you catch that detail? He throws aside his cloak when Jesus calls him. Earlier in this chapter, we read of a rich man who also stopped Jesus as Jesus was walking. And this rich man, he fell to his knees and asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And this rich man, he knew his Bible. He had followed all the commandments. And Mark tells us that Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing. Go sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor. You will have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. And at this, the rich man was shocked, and his face fell. And he went away grieving because, Mark tells us, he had many possessions. Contrast that with Bartimaeus. When the rich man heard the call of Jesus, he went away grieving because he had many possessions. But when Jesus calls Bartimaeus, what does he do? He casts aside his cloak. His cloak that has kept him warm at night. But Jesus calls him and he casts aside his cloak. His cloak is all that he had to shelter him from the harsh elements, to protect him from the harsh and unjust world. But when Jesus calls him, he casts aside his cloak. His cloak is his security, his comfort, his most valued possession, his only friend. But when Jesus calls him, he casts aside his cloak. He jumps to his feet and he responds to Jesus' call. He steps out of his comfort zone. Literally, he leaves behind the familiar world that he has always known and relied on. He doesn't know how he's going to find his way back to his patch if all this doesn't work out. He doesn't know if someone might not pinch that cloak that he just cast aside. All he knows is that Jesus is calling him and he is saying, yes. Yes. With all that is within me, yes. He comes to Jesus. And Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? Another detail. I mean, just before this story in Mark, we read about James and John. James and John wanted Jesus. They came up to Jesus and they wanted him to do whatever they asked for them. Do for us whatever we ask. That's what we want. And we hear that response from Jesus, what do you want me to do for you? The same exact words in a different tone of voice. And now he says those words to Bartimaeus. And unlike James and John, who were demanding positions of prestige and power for themselves, Bartimaeus says, Rabbi, I want to see. It's a response that is both bold in faith and heartbreakingly humble. Jesus says to him, go. Your faith has healed you. And Bartimaeus does go. But he doesn't go back to his patch. He doesn't go back to his comfort zone. He doesn't go back to his cloak. He goes with Jesus. The tragedies of life, the injustice of the world wanted to keep Bartimaeus on the side of the road, but Mark tells us immediately, he received his sight and he followed Jesus on the road, along the road. This is not simply a healing story. This is a call story. The rich man walks away sad. James and John get rebuked for their jockeying for position, and Bartimaeus hears Jesus' call, and he leaves his cloak behind, and he follows Jesus along the road that leads to Jerusalem. Do you see the significance in that? I'm talking to anyone who can identify with Bartimaeus now. Do you see the significance of his call for you? Jesus doesn't want you to stay stuck. You're not created to stay stuck. Whether you're wealthy with a lot of stuff or you're a beggar with a cloak, He is calling you tonight. He has a purpose for you. You might not see it just yet. That's all right. He sees it. He sees value and worth in you that you may not yet see. He has a path and a purpose for you, and while it might not be the path that you would choose, while it might not be the road that you would imagine, while it might not be the purpose that you had in mind, it might be a road of humility and hardship like the road to Jerusalem, but it's the path that he is walking before you, and a path that he walks with you. And you are in his presence as you respond to his call, and he will give you what you need to follow. You know, it's 2,000 years on, and we know Bartimaeus' name. We know Bartimaeus' name because he responded to the call of Jesus. Don't you worry about who knows your name or who knows your story. Jesus knows where you've been. He knows who you are. And he is calling you. He knows what's been going on inside you. He knows what's racing through your head and what's stirring in your heart, and he is calling you. Cast off your cloak. He is calling you. Get to your feet. He is calling you. Step out of your comfort zone. Jesus doesn't see you as a charity case. He sees you as a disciple, and he is calling you this very hour. What's your response?